Abraham, I will make you into a great nation. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you.
Many of you know that although we live in Colorado today, my wife and I are both from the Portland, Oregon area. And besides hippies and coffee, Portland is known for one thing: rain. In Oregon, we like to say it only rains once a year. It just starts sometime in September and doesn't end until June. And that's somewhat true, but December 2015 was the wettest month ever in Portland. In fact, up in the mountains, they ended up having 15.24 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. The result was that the ground became like this sponge, and it just became saturated with water. And when the ground is saturated with water, it's so full around it that it can't remain stable. And what resulted were massive mudslides everywhere. In fact, here's a picture of one of the mudslides that occurred near Mount Hood. The ground is so saturated by water that it becomes utterly unstable. In other words, it can't stand. Well, as followers of Jesus, we have a choice as we interact with society around us. We can be a sponge where we can just soak up our culture and become saturated with it, or we can be a rock. A rock is different than a sponge because a rock, it can't be saturated with water. It's impenetrable. So being a rock means we live in our culture, but not of our culture. And as we continue our verse by verse, chapter by chapter study into Genesis chapter 19, we're going to look at a man who's living as a sponge. He knows about God, through secondhand faith through his uncle Abraham. And yes, he knows all about God, and he knows a bit about what's right and wrong. But he's just been living as a sponge, soaking up the sin of his culture. And as a result, when he finally tries to make a splash for God, he's completely ineffective. And what we'll learn from his life is that a sponge can't splash. Genesis 19, verse 1. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. So we've been following these two angels for the past couple of chapters as they made their way to Sodom, first stopping with Abraham, where Sarah finally heard the Lord's voice for herself. But the two angels, you remember, they left on a mission, and don't miss it. Lot is the mission. God is about to nuke this city, and the angels have one purpose: to save Lot and his family, and to bring them out of this wicked city before it's destroyed. And where do they find Lot? In the gateway of his city. The reason I point this out is because it gives us a clue into Lot's life in the city of Sodom. Because only people of influence were allowed to sit in the gateway of the city, because that's where business was carried out. Lot is not an innocent victim in all this. Don't miss it. He is a full participant in the culture of Sodom, including the perversion and the disgusting sexual sin. And over the past few chapters, we've discussed justice, mercy, and grace. And remember our definition of justice? Getting what one deserves. As the Lord brings justice to Sodom, what does Lot deserve? Death and destruction right alongside everyone else in the city, because the wage of sin is death. But God is giving Lot mercy, or remember how we define that? Not getting what one deserves. Even though he's a sponge and he deserves it. Notice also that Lot responds the same way Abraham responded when he first met the Lord and the angels. Ironically, bowing down in humility because he knows what to do because of his uncle, who is a rock, not a sponge. Verse 2, "My lords," he said, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning?" "No," they answered, "we will spend the night in the square." So Lot was living in this evil culture, and he knew it. It was famous for its sin and its perverted sin. Don't miss that Lot completely understood this. He knew how evil his city was. Lot's motive for inviting these men to his house was for their protection. Because in Lot's eyes, these men, these angels, were not safe and needed protection. But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. So Lot was a sponge, and he soaked up the sin of his culture, but it didn't mean he didn't know how a man of God was supposed to act. He already bowed in reverence, only we know Abraham was bowing to the Lord, and here Lot's bowing to the angels. But don't miss the irony here in what he serves for dinner: bread without yeast. So throughout the Bible, yeast or leaven, it's an illustration of sin. Not that yeast or leaven is evil in itself or sinful, but it's an illustration as yeast makes its way through and saturates the entire loaf, causing it to transform and rise. It's ironic that Lot makes bread without yeast because the yeast is the sin of his culture, and it's made its way through his whole life because he's a sponge. Verse 4, before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." I mean, such a picture of the depravity of the city of Sodom. They were a bunch of wolves. This city is so perverted that it's not a small group of perverts. It is all the men of the city, both young and old, who were like ravenous wolves. These men were completely consumed by their own lust. All they could think of was their sinful, disgusting, perverted desires, to the point that as soon as they saw two good-looking strangers, they tried to devour them. Verse 6, Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him and said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, here, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do whatever you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." Dads, can you imagine? These 2 men have come under your protection. What about your daughters? Now think, were these 2 angels ever in real danger? Well, absolutely not. But instead of trusting in the power of God, Lot tries to control the situation himself. His solution? To offer a roaming group of perverted gang rapers to his own 2 daughters. Now, we catch a glimpse here as to how saturated the sin of his culture has become in Lot's life. Lot had become successful. He was a businessman in the gate of the city. He built that influence by being a sponge. That saturating sin had infected his judgment to the point that he thinks offering his daughters to a lust-filled gang of rapers seems to Lot like a noble option. He's trying to do what's right, but a sponge, it can't splash. Verse 9, "Get out of our way," they replied. "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge? We'll treat you worse than them." They kept bringing pressure on Lot and moved forward to break down the door. Lot had built up influence by soaking up his culture as a sponge. Now, Lot's a sponge now, but he's trying to act like a rock. But he's beginning to lose influence as this crowd of his friends begin to turn on him. Because when a sponge tries to act like a rock, he has no power. Why? Because a sponge's influence is dependent upon the culture around him. Realize there are 2 ways of building influence with people. First, it's easiest by being the same. This is It's what most people do. It's not just teenagers, but adults who go along with the crowd. We all do it. We all want to be liked. We all want to be winners. So we buy into the lies of our culture and think that the way the world thinks. We do what the world does, and we just go right along with it. We become callous to what righteousness is and what it means to live differently than our society. But that's the other way to build influence with people. It's by living differently. Rare people, they build influence by not being saturated, but by being impenetrable by our culture, by living differently than others, by a higher standard. They are able to influence others because they've earned the right to be heard. But that's the narrow road, and it's hard. But if you gain influence by being different, then when it's time to make a splash, people listen. Which is why so many who attend the church today, sadly, they're just as worldly. They seek the same riches, the same goals, the same divorce rates. Look at the same pornography statistics, the same have affairs, the same political stances, the same business practices, which all this ends up with a bunch of sponges who've soaked up the poison of the world, and they gather once a week in church and pretend that they're different. But God calls us to live differently, to be holy, set apart. Why? It's because as Jesus followers, we're to reflect His heart and His character, not the character of the world. And He created us to make a splash for Him. The problem for the church is our society is we're not making a splash because a sponge can't splash. Verse 10, but the men inside, the angels, reached out and pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. Then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, young and old, with blindness, so that they could not find the door. Again, were the angels ever in danger? Well, of course not. Lot could not, in his own power, do anything to protect the angels. But they were always safe. Ironically, this gang of men were filled with lust, so God took away their ability to see. Verse 12, the two men said to Lot, do you have anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here, because we are going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that He has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were pledged to marry his daughters. He said, hurry and get out of this place, because the Lord is about to destroy the city. But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. Why did they think he was joking? It's because Lot, they knew he was a sponge. They know it. And now he tries to be a rock, but they don't believe it because he was just a joke. Because when a sponge tries to act like a rock, they have no influence. Why? Because a sponge's clout is dependent upon going along with the culture around him. But that's so often how we treat our relationship with Jesus. Take this light as an example. Jesus said, you are the light of the world. But living for God, it's not a light switch that we can turn on or off. Yet that's how we treat it. We live for God when it's easy, at church, on Sunday morning, or maybe on a mission trip, or serving somewhere, or even at our house church. But the rest of our life, we turn it off. Driving on the road when someone cuts us off. At work, dealing with our boss or other people. Arguing with our wife, alone in front of the computer. When we separate our life with God from our regular life, and we let our light shine when it's convenient, but not when it's hard. And our lives, they're not believable. Our walk with Jesus becomes just a joke to our friends and our family members who know us best. We're just a sponge soaking up our society, and a sponge can't splash. Verse 15. With the coming of dawn, the angels urged to Lot, saying, "Hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you'll be swept away when the city is punished." When he hesitated, the men grasped his hand and the hands of his wife and of his 2 daughters and led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. There's that mercy we defined of not getting what one deserves. Lot deserved to die right alongside the city he loved, to the point that he hesitates to leave it. Well, why did Lot hesitate? Why didn't he run? Well, he hesitated because he didn't want to lose the power, the money, the pleasure, the influence he enjoyed in Sodom. He loved his lifestyle too much because he had soaked it all up. Verse 17. As soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, "Flee for your lives. Don't look back and don't stop anywhere on the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will be swept away." As soon as they're away, they're warned, run, flee for your lives. Don't look back. That old life, your old way of living and thinking, it's dead. Verse 18. But Lot said to them, "No, my lords, please. Your servant has found favor in your eyes, and you have shown great kindness to me in sparing my life, but I can't flee to the mountains. This disaster will overtake me and I'll die. Look, here's a town near enough to run to, and it's small. Let me flee to it. It is very small, isn't it? Then my life will be spared." You can see he's still fighting against running away from his old life because he's so saturated by it. He doesn't want to flee completely, but he wants to flee to a small town still close to Sodom, as if his old life will still be available. We'll see how this works out for him next week, because he and his daughters, they're still saturated by the sin of Sodom, because all 3 of them were sponges who completely soaked up the perverted sin of their culture. Verse 21, he said to him, "Very well, I will grant this request too. I will not overthrow the town you speak of, but flee there quickly, because I cannot do anything until you reach it." That is why the town was called Zoar. By the time Lot reached Zoar, the sun had risen over the land. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those who lived in the cities and also the vegetation in the land, and the destruction stopped. What was green, beautiful, and full of life was now full of death, because that's the wage that is earned from sin. It's always death. Verse 26, but Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. So why did Lot's wife look back? Well, she looked back for the same reason that Lot hesitated. For the same reason he had to be dragged away from the city. Lot's wife couldn't resist one last glimpse at the life of power, of wealth, sex, and influence she enjoyed in Sodom. She was just a sponge too, saturated by the culture of Sodom and Gomorrah, and she was heartbroken to leave it all behind. So the question, it comes to your own life as you relate to our culture and our society and the people living in it. Are you a rock or are you a sponge? Are you a rock living in our culture but not of our culture? Thereby, you're making a splash or an impact in our society by living differently? Or are you a sponge? Have you soaked in our culture and become saturated by it? Well, maybe take some time in your discussion in your house church to share some evaluation of how you're living in this dark culture, and then maybe pray over each other. Maybe take some time to share or even repent, and make this moment a time when you reject life as a sponge and begin to make a splash for the Lord.